Corsair, Apple Floppy Days, Commodore, Tandy Floppy Days, Atari, TI Floppy Days. The weekend comes, the disk drive hums, ready to code for you. These days we're all happy and free. Those floppy days, the games we play, you shared with me. Those days, Motorola, Intel 6502, graphics and text are there to view. Composite, color, or RGB, program fun for you and me.
Floppy Days is recorded in a live studio.
Inside PC Floppy Days, ST Amiga Floppy Days, Junior Sinclair Floppy Days, Classic Days, Microwaves, geeking all week with you. These days we're all happy and free. Those floppy days, the games we play, you shared with me. Those days, these floppy days are yours and mine. These floppy days are yours and mine. Floppy days.
The TRS-80 Model 3.
Introducing the Apple IIc.
Atari 1040 ST.
Commodore 64.
PC Junior, new from IBM.
Discover Atari.
It's at his Radio Shack Color Computer 3.
Introducing the Timex Sinclair 1000.
For computer, this is the one. Texas Instruments home computer.
A wonder computer of the 1980s, the Commodore VIC-20.
Welcome to Floppy Days number 124 for March 2023. I'm your host, Randy Kindig. We are currently covering the very productive year for home computers of 1982. This episode is the continuation of a multi-episode arc that covers the spectrum through all the usual topics. This is the sixth of those, with the first having been the interview with John Grant of Nine Tiles, the second and third being coverage of the history of the spectrum with Alessandro Grussu, the fourth being the interview with the author of the terrific book, the ZX Spectrum Ula, How to Design a Microcomputer, Mr. Chris Smith, and the fifth, covering tech specs for the Speccy with Chris. The topics covered in this episode include peripherals, using the machine, and magazines. Next episode, we will complete the ZX Spectrum coverage by talking about books, software, ads, modern upgrades, emulation, buying one today, community, and websites. As usual, I will also talk a bit about what I've been up to, including an update on any new acquisitions that have come my way. In addition, I'll briefly tell you about upcoming shows of which I'm aware and share any feedback I've gotten. Before we get started, I want to mention I now have some show sponsors for Floppy Days. 8bitclassics.com, run by my friend Corey Colts, is a great place to get vintage computer items. This includes video cables, power supplies, PC boards, cartridges, upgrades, and more for a wide variety of vintage computer platforms. In the new acquisitions section I cover each month on this show, I often talk about items that I've ordered from 8-Bit Classics. Corey has been a friend of the show for some time, and I really appreciate his support of the podcast. Check out the site. He has some great stuff. ArcadeShopper.com, run by my friend Greg McGill, is another terrific site to get vintage computer items. Greg has a wide variety of hard-to-find items for a large number of platforms. This is another site that I do and have done a lot of shopping at and have mentioned numerous times on Floppy Days. If anything shows out of stock, just ping Greg through the contact form and he can check whether he has or can get more of the item for you. I also want to mention those listeners who appreciate the show enough to donate through Patreon.com. This includes Chris Petzel, Tony Capolini, Lawrence, Richard Goldstone, Josh Malone, Andy Collins, Simon McCullough, Jason Moore, and Quentin Barnes. I really appreciate you guys, and it helps offset the cost of running the podcast. Let's get started.
Hi, this is John Grant. I wrote the BASIC and the other things in the ZX80 ROM. These days I'm working on things for 5G, new mobile, and trying to bring to today's digital systems something as new as we had back in the days of the ZX80. And you're listening to the Floppy Days podcast.
Okay, now for new acquisitions and what I've been up to. Most of what I'm going to talk about this month have to do with the things that were in the barn find, and I just want to give an update on some of those things. First off, I want to start out with the Amiga 1000s. I want to follow up on the story of the two barn find Amiga 1000s that I talked about last episode. I had a fairly long story about the testing and reconditioning of those Amiga 1000s, and I left this story partially done, so I just wanted to kind of follow up on that. In the last episode, Amiga number 1 was found to be fully functional with and without the Parcero upgrade, and I was waiting on the daughter board for Amiga number 2 to arrive that David Dunkley had modified, David Dunkley being the creator of the Parcero upgrade. He had modified the daughter board for Amiga number 2 for auto-booting the kickstart from ROM, as well as testing the internal drive in that Amiga to make sure that it was working properly, because I was having some issues with Amiga number 2 not actually booting up, and I wasn't sure whether it was a problem with the drive or just where the problem might be. So I got those back from David. I put them into Amiga number 2, and it still wouldn't boot. It loaded Kickstart from floppy, asked for the Workbench disk, appeared to read that disk, and then it would hang and never go anywhere. We knew the daughter board and floppy drive were fine due to David's testing, and the power supply appeared to be fine, so it had to be something on the motherboard. David actually told me he would be happy to take a look at the board if I sent it to him, which was very, very generous of him. I had to strip the Amiga number 2, all the way down to the motherboard. I stuck it in a box and mailed it to him. The same day he received it, he had pulled out the board and was doing some troubleshooting. He narrowed it down to a particular chip, which he promptly replaced, retested, and stuck in a box for return to me. When I received the board, I put the machine completely back together and tested it, first without the Parcero, and it booted, which was awesome, and then with the Parcero. With the Parcero, it now loaded Kickstart from ROM and Workbench from the Parcero and fully booted in just a few seconds. I love the speed and power of this machine with the Parcero, the 8 meg of RAM that it supplies, and the SD hard disk capability that it also supplies. David includes a bunch of software ready to run on the SD card that comes with the Parcero. So for the first time ever, I'm getting to experience the Amiga 1000 in its full glory. Again, David, if you're listening, thanks so much for your help and for an amazing modern upgrade. FYI, I've discussed with David about doing an interview about the Parcero on the podcast, so stay tuned for that. Staying on the barn finds, another machine that I wanted to talk about that was found to be non-functional but was certainly worth trying to fix was a Commodore SX64. It was in excellent condition on the outside, but it appeared that a mouse had nested on the top grill, dropping pee and excrement down into the machine, so it was pretty dirty on the inside. I opened it up and cleaned it as best I could before attempting to turn it on, but alas, the power light came on, but the computer wouldn't come up. Now luckily, we have a Commodore guru that's a member of the Indianapolis Computer Club, and his name is Elijah, produces a video podcast on YouTube called The Commodore Room, in which he often shows how to repair various Commodore machines. He told me he would be happy to use this SX64 as the subject of one of his videos, so I happily turned it over to him, hoping he could work his magic. The SX64 is one of those machines I've always had some fascination with and secretly wanted to own. It's an amazing representation of a portable version of a popular home computer, the Commodore 64. In fact, I'm told the SX64 was the first color portable computer ever made. However, they are highly prized and go for anywhere from $500 to $1,000 to acquire one, so honestly I never expected to own one. Discovering one in the barn find was like Christmas Day. I do intend to cover the SX64 on Floppy Days in a future episode, so I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but suffice it to say it's a very interesting machine. It took Lige some time to refurbish the machine, but he got it fully working. I provided a link in the show notes to the video, and you can see what he had to go through to clean up the damage caused by mice and the elements due to living in a barn for an extended period of time. I've had a lot of fun playing with the machine since he turned it back over to me. I'm not sure that I would want to work on the machine for a long time with that tiny, less than clear monitor, but it's a neat machine nonetheless. Thanks again so much to Lige and the Commodore Room for the great work getting the SX64 back in order. In addition, there were a few other machines that I had remaining to test. At this point, I have tested all machines that were in the barn find. But next up, I had 3 Osbornes that were in the barn, which was, I thought, somewhat unusual that there would be 3 Osbornes. I don't know whether the gentleman that I bought the barn find from had a particular affinity to Osbornes, or whether he was lucky enough to actually find 3 Osbornes in the wild when he was out buying these at garage sales and yard sales and so on, or whether he came across maybe one particular household where somebody was a big Osborne fan and had 3 machines. I'm not sure. But in any event, there were 2 Osborne 1s and an Osborne Executive. I did fire up all 3 of them. Now the Osborne 1 of the Osborne 1s I turned on, and it worked fine, and I was amazed because it did fire up and everything seemed to work great. So I left it turned on for a little while, and it probably was, I don't know, a half hour to an hour later, I heard this big pop, and there was a bunch of foul-smelling smoke coming out of the Osborne 1. So apparently a capacitor somewhere on the machine had blown, and I immediately shut it off, and am now looking to try to get it repaired, get the capacitor replaced, and get that working again. I did turn on the other 2 machines. The other Osborne 1 did not turn on at all. So it's possible that the capacitor already went on that earlier. So recapping it is probably a good idea. And I did find a place that has capacitor kits for the Osborne 1s already prepared. You just buy the kit and you're ready to go. I did also turn on the Osborne Executive. It surprisingly turned on and worked. Seemed to work great. Now, this time I did not leave it turned on, fearing it might blow a cap. But I do also have plans then, with the help of people from the Indianapolis Club, getting that recapped before it actually blows anything. I could not find a kit pre-made for the Osborne Executive, but I'm working with the gentleman who runs the site that does have the Osborne 1 cap kit, and he said he could put together an executive kit by looking at the documentation for that machine, and then he asked me if I'd be willing to take the executive apart to confirm that the information he has is accurate. So more to come on that. I'll keep you guys informed as far as how it goes with the Osborne 1s. The other thing with the Osbornes also is that there were a couple of suitcases full of Osborne software. So As you know, the Osbornes, because I talked about the Osbornes before on Floppy Days, one of the really nice things about the Osborne is that it came with a full set of software, and that was really unique for the day. And I had a very powerful suite of software that came with the machine. And I had a couple of suitcases full of software for the Osborne 1 and the Osborne Executive in the barn find as well. So I have all of that, all the discs and all the manuals. So again, I'll keep you informed how things go with the Osbornes. And that's it for what I've been up to this month.
Hello, I am Alessandro Grussu. I am the author of Spectrumpedia, the most comprehensive book about the ZX Spectrum, and you are listening to Floppy Days podcast.
Okay, now for upcoming shows. Because we're early in the year, there really haven't been any shows to this point during the winter months. So there are a huge number. I count at least a dozen that I'm aware of right now that are already scheduled for this year. So I'm going to go through this list fairly quickly, but make your plans. The reason I do this is so that people can make their plans to go, to help get the word out that particular shows are going on, if there's one in your area or even one that you might want to travel to. Feel free to do so. I'm going to get to at least 3, hopefully 4 or 5 of these things this year are my plans. And we'll see what happens. So, what's upcoming? Very first one, the April timeframe is very, very busy. First one is the Midwest Gaming Classic. That one is just a couple days after this podcast is being recorded, so it may already be over by the time you hear it, but it's March 31st through April 2nd at the Wisconsin Center in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. VCF East is April 14th through the 16th at the Info Age Science and History Museums in Wall, New Jersey. The same weekend is the Commodore Los Angeles Super Show, April 15th through 16th at the Burbank VFW Hall in Burbank, California. The very next weekend is the 31st annual Last Cocoa Fest, April 22nd through the 23rd, Holiday Inn and Suites, Chicago, Carroll Stream, Illinois. The very next weekend from that is the Indie Classic Computer and Video Game Expo. This is the very first one of those, April 29th and 30th at the Crown Plaza Airport Hotel in Indianapolis, Indiana. In June is the 64 Bits or Less Retro Gaming Festival, June 3rd through the 4th at the Benton County Fairgrounds in Corvallis, Oregon. Later in June is the BoatFest Vintage Computer Exposition, June 23rd through the 25th in Hurricane, West Virginia. That same weekend is VCF Southwest, June 23rd through the 25th at the Davidson Gundy Alumni Center at University of Texas at Dallas in Richardson, Texas. And also that same weekend, so there's 3 shows that very same weekend, Pacific Commodore Expo Northwest, June 24th through the 25th at the Interim Computer Museum in Seattle, Washington. In July, there are a couple of shows. Kansas Fest, the longest running annual Apple II conference, is July 18th through the 23rd at Rockhurst University in Kansas City, Missouri. The Southern Fried Gaming Expo and VCF Southeast is July 28th through the 30th in Atlanta, Georgia. August 12th is ZAP Live 2023 in the Holiday Inn, Kenilworth, CV8 1ED in the UK. VCF Midwest has been announced for September 9th through the 10th at the Waterford Banquets and Conference Center, Elmhurst, Illinois. Tandy Assembly, September 29th through October 1st, Courtyard by Marriott in Springfield, Ohio. Amy West, October 14th through the 15th in Sacramento, California. Portland Retro Gaming Expo, October 13th through the 15th, so it's the same weekend as Amy West. This is at the Oregon Convention Center in Portland, Oregon. And finally, the World of Commodore, December 2nd through the 3rd, Admiral Inn, Mississauga, Ontario, Canada. So that's it for upcoming shows that I'm aware of this year.
Hi, I'm Chris Smith, author of the ZX Spectrum Ula, How to Design a Microcomputer, and I'm the Chief Technology Officer of Retro Games Limited, behind such products as the C64 Mini Full Size and the A500 Mini. This is the Floppy Days podcast.
Okay, I had one bit of email feedback that I wanted to go through here. This one is from Klaus in Sweden. He says, just listen to the NEC PC 6001. It seems like there was another computer which is almost compatible with this one, the VTech Laser 200, but the laser lacks the sound chip. Also, I'm not sure about the graphics resolution because the wiki for the laser did not show the 256 by 192 mode. In the late 90s, my grandfather picked up a cheap Laser 200. We had no manuals or anything for that, so it was hard to know how the computer worked, and no software either. It was passed on to my younger uncle. He later got a VIC-20, as I recall, and I think I made a trade with him with some VIC-20 cartridges I had laying around, so I ended up with the laser. My grandfather, and the family in general, have tech knowledge. So my grandfather made a power supply for it from the parts he had lying around. And together with my older uncle, they found out how the tape interface worked. I guess one plug was used and was split into a mic ear to the tape recorder. I recall they used a shell from an electric power plug to make the house for that tape adapter. It was created over a weekend where the family was together, maybe for a birthday or something. Fun times. But at that time, we didn't have access to the internet, so we had no source of information about how to program the laser. I knew BASIC from my Memotech MTX, SpectraVideo 328, and MSX computers, so I quickly found out how to make simple programs. We simply tried out commands to see if the commands worked at the laser. In that time, I had a few years' experience with computers, so I started to look in the ROM of the laser and could see it was a Z80 computer. I also found the table for the basic commands. That helped a bit because now we know what to type, but we still didn't have the syntax for the commands. But I recall we ended up making simple games with graphics and sound for the laser, as well as apps like how to convert decimal numbers to Roman numbers, etc. I recall the keyboard was not great, but it could be used. If I'm not wrong, the space key was a smaller key to the right of the keyboard and not a big space bar. Thanks for a great podcast. I listen with the Android app from the car. It works well and downloads the podcast on the fly. Thanks again and keep up the good work. Appreciate it, Klaus. Thank you so much for writing in, and I appreciate the information about the laser. The laser is one of those machines I do intend to cover later, so thank you for that information. And that's it for feedback this month. Okay, let's get into the main part of the show with PJ Evans helping me talk about ZX Spectrum topics like peripherals, magazines, and pulling one out of the box. All right, I am here with PJ Evans. Do you prefer to be called Paul or you prefer to be called PJ?
I prefer PJ.
Okay.
The reason for that is I meet a lot of people called Paul Evans, and it's caused a lot of confusion in the past. So PJ it says.
Okay, perfect. Well, PJ, if you don't mind, maybe you can start out by telling us where you live and what you do today.
Well, I live in the city of Milton Keynes in England, And it's one of our more modern cities. It was only built in the 1960s, so it's unique in England. It's the only city that has a birthday, where we know what day it actually became a place where people lived. And one of the things I love about Milton Keynes is that it's very close to a place called Bletchley Park, which I'm sure we're going to be discussing, which is also home of the National Museum of Computing, where I'm a volunteer. But that's not the day job. The day job is I am a principal engineer with a quite famous retail chain in the UK. So I spend my day making sure people can buy things and they have a great experience and all that stuff that goes with that.
Okay, perfect. So you said you're a volunteer at the museum. What exactly do you do there?
Anything they tell me to, really. Now, on a serious note, what I love doing there, we all get muck in and we all do whatever needs doing, but what I particularly love doing is I give guided tours, and in particular on a device called Colossus, which is arguably the world's first programmable computer. And it was built to defeat some Nazi codes in the early 1940s. It was successful in doing so. And all the people were sworn to secrecy on the existence of that computer, went away to universities after the war, and then suddenly got very good at building these new computer things, and basically kick-started the entire industry that we know today.
Now, is that the computer that the movie, the Foreman Project, was actually based on?
I love that movie.
I know, isn't that a great one? It's an old movie, but it's great.
Yeah, it's a good one. No, not quite. It's quite a beast, Colossus. It's 2,500 valves. It's a huge behemoth of thing. Runs at 75 kilowatts. So it's nice and warm in there. But we actually have one. It's not the original, but it's a rebuild of one of the 10 that were built. So anyone going to the National Museum of Computing, and if any of your visitors are in the UK or traveling to the UK, it's to all people who would listen to your podcast, it's so worth a visit. You'll have a great day there seeing some huge old mainframe computers, arguably the first computer, right up to the stuff I look after there, which is what we're here to talk today about, Sinclair stuff, right up to modern devices like iPhones and such like.
Yeah, one day when I get over there, I'd love to see that museum. It sounds like it's pretty awesome.
Well, I'm only down the road, so I'll be happy to give you a tour.
Oh, perfect. That sounds great. It's a date. It's a date. So tell us about your vintage computer history. How did you start with personal computers, and then how did you get into Spectrum?
Well, right, we're going to have to discuss my age now, aren't we? Okay, that's... So I wrote my first computer program aged 9 years old. And what had happened was I'd lost my coat, and I was at primary school. I think kindergarten is probably a good analogue for that. And I was 10 years old. No, 9 years old. I just said it, 9 years old. And I went to see the headmaster or principal during lunch break to see if anyone handed my coat in. And I knocked on the door, and he said, "Come in," and opened up. And there was this strange white television object on his desk that he seemed to be very confused by. And I said, "Sir, what's that?" And he said, it's a computer. I had no idea what he was talking about. And he said, "I can't quite get it working. Would you like to help?" I thought, okay. And at that point in my formative years, I touched my first computer. It was a Commodore PET, the one with the chiclet keyboard. And every primary school in England had been given one by the government to sort of kickstart bringing in computing. And here I am, just by complete coincidence, bumping into it. It took me about 10 minutes to get it working and load a game called Duck Shoot. And that's the rest is history, really, from that point on. I ended up teaching the teachers at the school how to use it. And all my lunch breaks and break times were spent frantically typing in programs that I bought from magazines like Your Computer to see what I could make it do. So my poor old father, who was, I'm not trying to do the old sort of "we was poor" card, but he was a Liverpool docker. We weren't particularly well off in any kind of way, and yet here I was badgering him for this thing I'd discovered called a ZX81, which was a little black box with keys on it that was much smaller than the Commodore PET, but it was a computer that you could afford to have at home. And my poor old dad actually managed to get the money together to get me one for Christmas. And from that point, I was hooked. Fast forward a year, and of course, we hear about the ZX Spectrum being announced, and it's like, sound and colour? What witchcraft is this? This is going to be incredible. So, for the benefit of your listeners, the PET had no colour or sound. Neither did the ZX81. ZX81 only had one kilobyte of memory, of which you could only access so many bytes before problems started happening. Whereas the ZX Spectrum could go in 16 and 48K, which just seemed ridiculous to me. There's only one problem was that although my father, bless him, was happy to get one for me because they were very well priced, all the other mums and dads in the country also had said to the kids they can get one. So although we placed an order sort of right at the beginning, and you did it in the post those days, you had to send a cheque to Sinclair in Oxford, and it was 9 weeks of me every day running down the street back from school to see whether the postman had been that day, whether the parcel had arrived. And then one day it did, and there was my ZX Spectrum 48K. I was absolutely besotted with it, took it everywhere I went. 2 days later, showing my auntie how it worked, I tripped over the power cable and broke it.
Oh, no. That's terrible.
I blew the ULA. Oh. At that time, I just had some beautiful colours on the screen. Heartbroken. And then it was another 6 weeks before I got the second one.
No. Okay.
There you go.
Wow.
And that's how I started with the ZX Spectrum.
Gotcha. Well, so did you have anything after that?
Oh, yeah. I went through the whole lot. So I had obviously went from Spectrum to a Spectrum Plus. That was a very common thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
Got that keyboard. Although, I won't have a word said against the original ZX Spectrum keyboard. I actually quite like it. I think it's very tactile to work with. So this dead flesh thing that's famously associated with it doesn't do anything for me. I found the ZX Spectrum Plus keys a bit more clanky, but it was more robust when it's being held around by a 12-year-old. But from a collection side of things, I had the Spectrum for a long time, and I remember reading in a magazine that they said that Elite couldn't be ported to the ZX Spectrum. It was impossible. And at that point, we had the BBC Model B, which had been given to all the secondary schools in big numbers. So we had all these computer labs full of BBC Model Bs. I did my work experience being the technician in the room, helping out with everything. That was great fun. Learned a lot about that particular computer. And we had Elite on it. And Elite was just the most mind-blowing game you'd ever seen. It was 32K, which was the memory limit of the BBC, and you had this entire universe or this galaxy you could explore and trade, and it just no one understood how they did it. In fact, I still don't to this day. And it's all I wanted to play, and you couldn't play on the ZX Spectrum, and they said we're not going to do it to the ZX Spectrum, can't be done. So BBC Model Bs were famously quite expensive. So they weren't normally found at home. You either had a ZX Spectrum or a Commodore 64. Very few people had BBC Model Bs. And so we couldn't possibly afford that. So I convinced my dad that we will sell the Spectrum and we'll get an Electron, which is the cheaper version of the BBC. And it had Elite. You could run Elite on it. So I was happy. I had Elite. And of course, about 2 months later, Elite came out for the ZX Spectrum.
Yeah.
It was, and it was really, really good. It was like, oh, okay. So I actually ended up selling the Electron and going back to the Spectrum. And
oh, did you really? Wow.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I saw the error of my ways, And I think by then the 128 was out. I managed to get hold of a 128, which is still to this day a magnificent machine. So much fun to play with.
So like the +2 or?
Oh no, this predates that. So this was the last Sinclair made by Sinclair themselves before sold to Amstrad. So it's the famous toast rack version with the sink on the side, which if you've had it on for a couple of hours and you brush your hand over it, you've got third-degree burns. But still an absolutely wonderful machine, and possibly a favourite. So what happened then? You're testing me now. So we had the 128. I think at that point, I never went with the Amstrad ones. I never had a +2 or a +3.
Mm-hmm.
But I think around that time, I traded in my 8-bit for a 16-bit and went up to an Atari ST.
Oh, you went to the ST. Okay. Yeah, I've got some knowledge of that one because I had one too back in the day.
Yeah, it was a 520. And later a 1040.
Okay.
So I think, looking back now, I think it was just because we had such rivalry. I don't know if it was the same in the States, because I know that the Sinclair, the Timex Sinclair, didn't make anywhere near as big as Impact, but there was a furious rivalry in the UK between Sinclair and Commodore. And I think just on principle that I was a Sinclair guy, I was not going to get an Amiga.
Gotcha.
Even deep down, it was the better machine.
It's going to be anything but a Commodore. Huh? Gotcha. That's funny. And then you probably went to IBM compatible after that, I would imagine, right? After that.
That's absolutely right. Yes. So I did my university dissertation on the ST. I did my A-level dissertation on the ST. And then, during my university years, I got my first, my 286, which I look back now, it was horrendous. So it was a 10 meg hard drive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, and 2 meg memory or something, stuff like that. Yes, and then then it all gets very boring. All the went
exactly.
So you have to beige boxes, 386, 486, blah blah blah.
Right. I'm with you there. It does get boring, once you start going to the PC line of things. But that's why I try to focus on everything other than the IBM PCs, pretty much. But. So what do you have today? You have anything today?
Yeah, I got lucky. I went to there's a little retro shop just north of me in a place called Northampton, and I popped in, and they specialised in consoles. And I said, well, I was looking for more 80s era microcomputer stuff, and he said, oh, we've got so much of that in the basement. Let me bring it up. And brought up all these crates of gold dust, basically, as far as I was concerned, and didn't want too much for it. So I came home with all these crates, and it really kick-started rebuilding the collection again. This was quite a few years ago now, but it made me think, I need to get back to this. I'm having fun here. So there was some Spectrums in there, some BBCs, an old Atari VCS. And, I just started having some fun and hunting around, looking for things, car boot sales, for flea markets. And I built up a collection there. So I've basically got, without going into the ZX Spectrum issues, I don't collect issues of the different versions of the PCB inside. So they go from issue 1 to 6A, or 6B, I think. I've got one of every model that was ever produced, including the Amstrads.
Yeah. Okay. Wow.
And I've got a few odd versions as well. So one of the things about the ZX Spectrum is it's an RF output. So you need a device with a tuner in it to tune into it. But with a soldering iron in about 5 minutes of your time, you can turn it into a composite output, and it's then happy with any kind of flat screen TV you throw at it. So I've got one that's pure. It's got its original manual. It's in its original polys and box. That one gets looked after and never touched. And I've got a ZX Spectrum that's modified for composite output. And I've also got some ZX Spectrums that I built myself. So this is a long-going project where we end up with a dead PCB, and we've got a nice case. So one of the fun things to do is to hook up a Raspberry Pi inside there and run an emulator, but actually try and hook everything up so you can use it as a regular Spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the first projects I did when I got into Raspberry Pis was work out how to interface with the keyboard and read the keyboard matrix, so I could feed that into a Spectrum emulator, Fuse, running on the Raspberry Pi, and therefore I could sit and have a Spectrum that was sort of based on modern technology. You can do all, have all the built-in peripherals that I could never afford as a kid, just by switching them on in the menus. So I've got one of those, and I've also got a Harlequin, which was a design of ZX Spectrum. It's a ZX Spectrum format PCB, so it will fit in any ZX Spectrum case, but it doesn't require the ULA. So the ULA, the Universal Logic Array, was the proprietary chip that went into a Spectrum that handled all the video and talking to the ZAC and all the rest of it. And that has not been made for many, many, many years. So if you've got a broken Spectrum, you've got a broken ULA, your only hope is to find old stock and replace it. But the Harlequin doesn't require the ULA. It's built using many more chips, but they all come together to do the same functionality. And that's a kit you can buy today and make yourself a brand new ZX Spectrum, which I think is pretty cool.
Yeah, I've heard of that. So cool. Sounds like you've got a really large Spectrum collection primarily.
Yeah, I've got a bit of everything, really. I'm just having a look around the room now, thinking what my life's come to. No, it's I've got that. I've got some Nintendo stuff. I've also got some other sort of Spectrum bits and pieces, like the Spectrum Micro TV. The Sinclair Micro TV.
Oh, Sinclair stuff. Okay, wow, cool.
Yeah, that's because he was obsessed with making portable televisions. And two decent ones, and I've got a couple of those. And I've also got actually one of my favourite computers of all time, which is after he sold Sinclair, was he formed Cambridge Computers and made the Z88, which is a battery-powered
computer. I've heard of it. I don't have one. But
to this day, I think it's a remarkable machine. And
I've heard a lot of good things about that machine. I've always thought about getting one. Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of things we actually saw in technology much later on were already working on that machine, like solid-state storage. It had it out of the, way back in, what was it, 91, I think I had mine.
Okay.
But it's still sitting there on the shelf, still works. So there's another thing for its longevity, it's still working fine.
Well, great. Sounds like you've got a really interesting personal collection, and thank you for sharing that with us, telling us all about it. Appreciate that. So we have a lot of stuff to get to talk about the Spectrum, and I'd like to go ahead and move forward into that if you don't mind. And obviously with your knowledge of the Spectrum, and I think there's a lot you can add to the topics as we go along here. And we're going to talk about all the way from peripherals to modern websites. So there's a lot to cover here. So ready to jump into those topics?
Can't wait.
All right, cool. All right, we're going to start out with peripherals, and there were quite a few available in the day, and obviously there are even more things available that you can get today, that are more modern that we'll talk about later. But as far as what was available in the day, the ZX Spectrum was always very, very much cassette based. Mm-hmm. Right? And the original machines didn't have any sort of built-in cassette drive, but you could easily connect. You had the ports for connecting to a cassette recorder and loading things from cassette. And then the later machines, like the Plus 2, starting with the Amstrad machines, had cassette recorders built into them in order to load cassette software. I don't think the floppy drive was ever anything that was... I know they came out with the 128 plus 3 that had a built-in 3-inch floppy drive, a 3-inch floppy drive, but I don't think it was ever very popular.
No, it was not. The the actual drives themselves did get some traction with a later Amstrad computer. Amstrad did this quite a genius idea, really. They realised that people were fed up of like having to sequester the television and find a tape deck and all the rest of it, and a lot of people just wanted to do word processing. So they came up with this word processor that came with a monitor, a dot matrix printer, and it had this drive built into the monitor, and the computer was in the monitor as well, and then a keyboard. And it was basically a word processor that did everything you wanted to do, and it was £299, which at that time was a steal. And until Raspberry Pi came along, that was the biggest selling computer made in the UK ever. And that used those 3-inch drives. So that was actually a bit in the sun, was that computer there.
And it's my understanding is that's the reason they put a 3-inch drive into the Plus 3 when they finally built one into the Spectrum.
That's right. Yes.
Yeah, which was an odd size. I don't even know. Can you even get 3-inch floppy disks these days if you have one of these machines that has a 3-inch drive?
They do very well on eBay secondhand.
Yeah, I'll bet they do.
I think I've got 4 or 5, and I look after them very well.
Yeah,
and I've got a handful of games that were released on the format as well. But yes, it wasn't a great idea when it was blindingly obvious. I mean, I remember at the time when it came out, everyone really couldn't understand. So it wasn't them trying to like try something new or something. Everyone was like, "Well, why don't you go 3.5? Everything else is going 3.5."
Right.
So yeah, it's still a mystery to this day.
My understanding too is that there were micro drives, which were
yes,
ring tape cartridges that were available for the Spectrum as well, beginning in '83, I guess. But I don't think those ever took off either.
No, and rightly so, in my opinion. So they released the Interface 1, which was an attachment to the ZX Spectrum that gave it a few more capabilities. The big one, well, I think it was like network and printer control. The big one was the ability to run microdrives. So microdrive was a Sinclair-only invention. It was a tiny little cartridge, about 1 inch square, had a loop of tape in it. So there wasn't any spindle or anything inside it. The tape was just all stuffed inside there on a loop. And it went into a little black box, which is your microdrive, and you could have up to, I think it was 8, all connected together. And it basically increased loading time, so it was much, much faster than a cassette deck. And in terms of read, much more reliable. However, in terms of physical performance, much less reliable. And the biggest problem with microdrives were, for what they were, they didn't add enough for the money, and they were so prone to snapping. So they were a brave idea. I mean, Clive Sinclair himself has got this amazing history of bravery when it comes to innovation. He wasn't afraid to invent. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. That was one of the didn'ts.
Right. I'll bet those are hard to acquire and especially working microdrives.
Well, actually, turns out they're very repairable.
Oh.
So microdrives themselves, there's a lot of community work has gone into documenting them and common errors that happen with them. I mean, at the end of the day, it's got a tape head like any other cassette has. That's what it uses. The biggest problem with them is the actual cartridges themselves. They're very susceptible to perishing, especially the little felt pad that presses against the head when you put the cartridge in. If you've got a microdrive back from the 80s now, chances are it's turned to dust. But it's replaceable. And it's one of the things that's always impressed me about the Sinclair community is they will get these things up and running no matter what. Right.
Yeah. There's always somebody that's able to figure them out and get them working.
Yeah. There's a great community out there for that. So it's very hard to actually come up with a completely dead ZX Spectrum. There's always someone who says, no, try this. Replace that capacitor. That memory chip's gone. Replace that memory chip, and you're up and running again.
Yeah. Okay, on the joystick front, now I guess I'm a little bit confused in that I know the original Spectrum didn't have any type of joystick interface.
No.
But Sinclair eventually did put joystick ports on the Plus 2. In the meantime, there had been, I think in the meantime, there had been another interface developed called the Kempston interface that used the Atari joystick port standard, which makes a lot of sense. And then when Sinclair developed their joystick ports, they actually made them work differently so that, I guess they wanted you to buy their joysticks and not joysticks produced by someone else. Am I explaining that correctly?
You are, and it wasn't one of Sinclair's most popular moves. It was it did not go down well. And there was a boom market when the Plus 2 came out in joystick adapters. Because there was no difference in the actual connector. It was still a DB9 connector. It was just wired differently. So all you had to do is come up with a little adapter that would just change the wiring around. You could plug anything you want into it. You didn't have to buy Sinclair's own joysticks.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of joysticks later on came out with, they would have two connectors on them. One would be black and one would be grey to signify the grey case of the Plus 2.
Oh.
Plug the one in that you want.
Okay.
So it achieved very little. Well, I would not go as far to argue it didn't achieve anything at all, because the problem was that the Sinclair joystick that it came out with was terrible. It was a very, very bad joystick. So everyone just wanted to use, a Quick Shot 2 or something like that, one of the classic Kempston joystick. But yeah, one of the things that was brilliant, or continues to be brilliant about the ZX Spectrum, is that everything was about cost. Everything was about reduce cost. So don't put anything in there you don't need to. So when it comes to peripherals, if you look at a BBC Model B, for instance, and you look underneath it, there are all these different ports. And each of these ports has a cost. All these connectors cost money.
Right.
Having the wiring for them costs money. Sinclair said, we're not going to do any of that. We're just going to have this one thing at the back, which is a direct bus to the ZX80. Do what you want.
Yeah.
So a brilliant idea. Absolutely brilliant idea. Got the costs right down. It also led to a lot of creativity by the third-party manufacturers to build new and exciting things. So one of the very first things that appeared was Kempston's joystick interface. So now you can plug a joystick in and play a game using a joystick. And because they got there first, and all the games manufacturers were desperate to have something that worked with a joystick so they could improve the playability of their games, that just became the de facto standard.
Became the standard, yeah. So it sounds like Sinclair was a little too late to the party with their version of that.
Horrendously so. Yeah. There were two standards. There was Kempston standard and there was the cursor standard. So one would emulate the up, down, left, right cursor keys via the joystick. And then, they decided for whatever reason just to come up with something completely different, which confused a lot of people. But as I say, it was worked around quite quickly.
So do you actually have any original Sinclair joysticks yourself?
I do. I'm lucky enough to have one that's still in the box.
Oh, wow.
A few years ago, someone found about 50 of them in a warehouse that had never been sold. Mm-hmm. And they put them up for a very reasonable price, I've got to say. So I'm very lucky to have one of those. But I never play it because firstly, it's nice to keep it in its box and everything, but they're also not very nice joysticks to use.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Let's jump into printers. So they had a thermal printer called the ZX printer. It was actually produced originally for the ZX81. A little 4-inch wide black paper coated with thin layer of aluminum. And not a very high resolution, 32 characters or 256 pixels.
That's correct. So it matched the resolution of the Spectrum itself. So the idea is you could put screenshots out on it, which is what a lot of people did.
Yeah. And then there also was the Alphacom 32 printer, which I think maybe was used on a lot of different computers. I recently had a barn find that has two Alphacom 32 printers in it. They were utilized on a VIC-20 instead of on a Spectrum. But Alphacom 32 was also a thermal printer, used the same interface, so it could be used on a ZX81 or Spectrum as well. And it also used standard thermal paper, so it was easy to get paper for.
Yeah, the Alphacom was a much, much nicer printer, but also much more expensive.
Oh, was it? Okay.
Yeah.
So
don't ask me what the actual price was, but it was. I think it was twice the price of ZX printer.
Does that pretty well cover the primary printers that were used on the ZX Spectrum?
Yeah, I mean, it was possible to hook it up. There were Centronics interfaces available, so you could actually go up to Epson RX80 or something like that. But, that wasn't really what most people had Spectrums were there for. If I'm absolutely blunt about it, the biggest reason people bought a ZX printer was so they could print out tape covers for the pirated games they got off the mate to make them look really cool. Because the width of the ZX printer paper fitted exactly in a cassette case. So, not that I'm condoning piracy.
Right. But we saw it on all the platforms, so it's not just the ZX Spectrum.
But yeah, I mean, I had a little ZX printer. You can still get the paper if you look hard enough. There seems to be quite some new old stock. There seems to be quite a lot of it knocking around. But yeah, you can. And Alphacom 32 paper is just standard thermal roll, so you can still get that today. But at the National Museum of Computing, we've got quite a few Alphacom 32s, and I've got to say, very reliable machines, still work.
Nice. Okay. Well, so on the expansion front, I probably should have talked about this first, but there actually were two different interfaces that were available, the Interface 1 and Interface 2. One is for allowing use of microdrives, had 8K of ROM, a serial port, a proprietary LAN interface, and an interface for the connection of up to 8 microdrives. And then Interface 2 had 2 joystick ports and a ROM cartridge port. And as we talked about, the joystick ports were not compatible with the Kempston de facto standard. So they don't work with a lot of games. But those were the two interfaces that were available in the day. So are you pretty familiar with both of those?
Yeah, these were the two official interfaces released by Sinclair. I mean, back in the day, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of different types of things you could plug into the back of your Spectrum and make it do things. And of course, if you were very brave, you could make your own as well. And there was a big community, and still is to this day, as far as I can see, of people like making their own circuit boards. Because the ZX80 is very hackable. You can get into it. You can make your own things. But yeah, these are the two official ones. So the big thing about the Interface 1 was the microdrives. If you bought an Interface 1, that's why you were buying it. Although the local area network was a thing, the ZXNet, I don't think I ever saw it in actual use for anything other than demonstration purposes. I'm not sure what people ever achieved with it. I could be completely wrong about that. People could have done amazing things with it, but I've never came across it myself. Same with the serial port. It's like, unless you're doing like maybe some homebrew projects or something, there wasn't a big market, I think is what I'm trying to say, for using those things.
So it seems like the ability to have a local area network of up to 64 spectrums, I mean, that sounds like something that maybe would have been targeted at the educational market.
I think that's exactly what they were trying to do. And the history of ZX Spectrum versus the BBC Model B would suggest that, because the BBC handled networking very well with Ethernet. And it was pretty cool in school to be able to send files to each other and messages to each other over network, and also access network storages. And I think that's what Sinclair wanted to happen. But I don't think it ever really took off. The best use of the LAN interface I've ever seen only happened a few years ago. In the ZX Spectrum manual, which is an excellent book written by Steve Vickers, there is a section about how to make music. And I can't remember what the piece of music was off the top of my head, but it was a piece of classical music. And as a little joke at the end, he said, he did the first 4 bars or something like that, and then it said, for an exercise, complete the entire symphony. And a guy called Chris Westcott decided to do that. And he got together with a load of people in Oxford, got together a load of ZX Spectrums, networked them together, and then actually performed the entire symphony just with the ZX Spectrums.
Nice. That's cool. That's a neat implementation. Yeah.
Yeah. He's a very clever guy, and so that's the best use I've ever seen of the ZX network.
Yeah. And we already talked a little bit about the keyboard, or you did. You said you liked the ZX Spectrum keyboard.
I'm not ashamed of that.
And I know a lot of people didn't, though, and there were a lot of keyboards that were available that you could connect in place of the original keyboard.
Yes, I accept I'm a minority in that view. So, it was one of the first upgrades you did, basically, especially before the Plus came along with its robust keyboard.
Right.
I mean, one of the biggest problems, a real problem with the original keyboard was the membrane breaking. They changed manufacturers at some point. I'm not entirely sure when. I think Samsung took over the manufacture of the membranes, and they were a much higher quality. But the original ones would, over time, dry out and just snap. They would become very brittle. So it was very common in a ZX Spectrum for lines of keys to just stop working. So a big market in replacement keyboards came along, and it was it's actually quite a simple job to do. It took you about 10 minutes to just take out disconnect your original keyboard, put your PCB in this new box, and connect the ribbon cables in, the 2 ribbon cables, and then you've got your nice new keyboard. And I seem to remember DK-Tronics were the kings of that. They made some amazing, proper mechanical, chunky keyboards that you could get. I think the Spectrum Plus, though, killed off that market to an extent, though.
Yeah, I imagine that's the case. Yeah. Are there any other peripherals that you wanted to cover that we didn't talk about at this point?
Yeah, I've got a couple of honourable mentions, and This goes back to a bit of my history with the ZX Spectrum itself. So, one of the things I ended up doing with my time with the ZX Spectrum is I used to read Crash magazine all the time. And another thing I was into was online communication. And I was a big teletext fan. And I heard about this thing called Prestel, which was teletext but in both directions. You could talk to it as well. So, and then there was an offshoot of Prestel called Micronet 800, which is aimed at people who are into computing. And you talk to it over your telephone line. So you needed a thing called a modem. I wasn't sure what one of these was, but there was one made for the ZX Spectrum called the Prism VTX 5000. And it was the sort of shape of it. It was exactly the same size as the Spectrum, but flat. So your Spectrum sat on top of it, and then a ribbon cable connected it to the peripheral connector at the back. And then you could plug a telephone line into it, and then you could connect to other computers. You could connect to this Micronet service in Prestel and get all this information and talk to other people. And it's really been fascinating for me because I got so into it. I wrote to Crash and said, you don't cover online communications with the Spectrum in your magazine. Why not? Because I'd like to know what's going on out there. And they wrote back and said, no, we don't have anyone who knows about that. Would you mind doing it? And me as a very excitable I think 16-year-old then said, yeah, yes, please. And so I ended up for about a couple of years writing for Crash, covering a regular column called Crash Comms, which was all about what was going on in the Spectrum world on these services, BBSs, Prestel, Micronet 800, and so on.
Oh, wow. That's cool.
So when this whole internet thing came along, I was like, well, I've already seen that. Yeah, we used to download software to our ZX Spectrums from Prestel, and we had a thing. I don't know, see if you can get the idea around this concept. So we had this thing on Micronet 800, and you went onto it, and you could type a message, and everyone else on it could see it. And then they could reply with a message, and everyone else would see that message. And you could follow people, so you could see what messages they were sending. Sound familiar? Well, that was called...
A little bit, yeah.
And that was back in the late 1980s, Turbo Chat. And it was like, so when Twitter appeared, I've seen all this before. So yeah, a special mention for the Prism VTX 5000, which started me in a sort of sideline of writing for magazines, which I still do to this day. I write for the Magpie magazine, which is the official Raspberry Pi magazine.
Oh, you do? Okay. I'll have to look for your name in there. I read a lot of those. I've subscribed for a while.
Oh, great.
So, yeah.
Well, I've done the ZX Spectrum projects in there a few times. So as I've done updates to it, so you can see how you can wire up a ZX Spectrum keyboard if you've got a dead Spectrum to a Raspberry Pi, and bring it back to life again. So that was a real pivotal moment of me starting out in what became the internet. Other one I would like to mention is the wafer drive. So this was an attempt to build upon the microdrive, which had been seen as a bit of a failure. But the wafer drive was much bigger storage, much faster, and it was a big block. It was about the same dimensions as the ZX Spectrum, but much higher. It was I'd say about 3 inches high. And it would have 2 slots in it. So you had 2 drives in it, and the wafer drives were much longer. Still the same idea. It was still just all tucked in a loop of tape. And huge amount of storage, really, really fast, and suffered from exactly the same problem that the microdrives did. So although they came up with something bigger and better and faster, not necessarily cheaper, it was just as unreliable. And my history of the wafer drives was snapped tapes all over the place and pulling it out on the whole reel of tape, just like you had with cassette tapes back in the day. But there's still a decent trade in those if you can find one that works properly. My last experience with one a few years ago was not very productive. Final one will be the Cura Microspeech, which was a favorite of mine. So this was a very early attempt at speech synthesis. So it was a little black box that went into that all-encompassing peripheral port in the back of the ZX Spectrum. And then you had to loop your RF signal. So you had the Spectrum didn't output any audio to your television. It had its own little speaker, a little buzzer inside it. But with the Cura Microspeech, you sort of had a loop that went from the Spectrum into the back of it and then out to your television, and it would put the audio out through the television. And that would, if people had written games that knew that peripheral was there, it could speak to you. And you could also write your own programs. It came with like ROM commands that would allow you to do some speech synthesis. And I had hours of fun with that thing, even though you couldn't understand a word it was saying.
It was a speech synthesizer. It wasn't the best, but it worked, right? So
I'd sit there with my dad, and he'd be like, "What did it say?" He said, "No, Dad, listen. You can hear it." I can't make a word it's saying. Yeah, very good times. There's one more thing I want to mention, but I think we're going to get to that later. So there's some of my favourites from back in the day.
Okay, very cool. Nice information. Appreciate that. All right, the next topic we're going to jump into is actually using the machine. So what's it like to acquire one of these machines and pull it out of the box? What does it look like? How much does it weigh? How do you start it up? What sort of things do you do to actually use it? Because every machine's different, and it's always helpful to just kind of understand how you even utilize it. I know the Spectrum is a little unique in that regard, just as the ZX81 was as well, because when you first bring it up, you don't necessarily know what you're supposed to do at that point. But first of all, let's start out with just pulling it out of the box. So the original ZX Spectrum obviously is remembered for its rubber chiclet keyboard. It's very, as you mentioned already, it's really small size. You said you used to take yours around with you wherever you went. You could easily do that because it was so small and light. It's only, and I'm going to use inches rather than the when I originally came across the dimensions, they were obviously in millimeters, but about 9 inches by 6 inches by a little over 1 inch. So
yeah,
pretty small, and only just over a pound in terms of weight. So it's a very small machine. I know I like it here because I don't have a lot of display space, but it doesn't take a lot of room to find somewhere to put your ZX Spectrum and display that. So that's nice.
Yeah, it's true. I'm just looking at one of mine that's stuck on the wall at the moment. So they make nice wall ornaments.
Yeah.
But don't worry,
yeah, imagine
well looked after.
And it's got that distinctive rainbow motif on it as well. The original machine does. So it's definitely it's a unique look, and when you see one, you know you're looking at a ZX Spectrum, even if someone doesn't tell you that's what it is.
Yeah, it was a genius bit of branding, actually, putting that rainbow stripe on it.
When you open the box, and again, this was for the original ZX Spectrum 16K or 48K, you had a basic programming book, you had an introduction, there was a introductory software cassette, which had a lot of programs on it, and it had power supply, an RF cable, and a cassette cable.
Yeah, so you needed two more things. You needed some kind of cassette deck.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And there was a huge market in those, one specifically made for computer use, but anything you could get your hands on would do, really. But the biggest problem was you also needed a TV.
Right.
And back in those days, the idea of having more than one television in the house was pretty much unheard of. So a lot of negotiation went on with the parents about when you could have your time slot. So, of course, they had their favourite soaps, and the match was going to be on, the soccer. You had to make sure that you get some time in. So normally it was straight after school because they were still at work, and you could get home, you could grab the telly, plug that RF cable in, wire up a cassette deck, and you were off. But some of the genius of the Spectrum was that basic programming manual. So I mentioned it before, Dr. Stephen Vickers wrote it, and it was so well written, so accessible that, little old me, I think 11 years old by that point, was able to understand and play around and write programs, and it was so exciting. But of course, on day one, what you got out was Horizons, which was the cassette that came with it, that had some introductory programs, and it was good because although you look back at it now and it seems a bit tedious, when you've never done this before, it was hugely instructive and informative as to how you use this computer. So you put the tape in, you did load, did quote or double quote, and then you got this sort of flashing border that you didn't know quite what that meant. And then you press play, and normally the first time it would completely fail to load because you haven't got the volume at the right level or whatever.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was going to say that was true of a lot of different machines. I remember with my TRS-80 Model 1, it was exactly the same issue. I mean, you had to have that volume level set exactly right in order to get things loaded properly. So
yeah,
it was a common issue.
I was forewarned because I had a ZX81, and they are very, very difficult to load software off tape into. So the Spectrum was a breeze by comparison.
Yeah.
But yeah. So you go through the Horizons tape. There was a couple of games on there. There was some graphics to explain to you what was going on, and then you were started, and you could dive into that basic programming manual and get going.
I never have seen that cassette. Obviously, I got my Spectrum 48K off of eBay. It did not include the cassette, so I don't know what that looks like, but I'm sure it's pretty easy to get it somewhere on the internet and get it loaded into an emulator or put onto a real cassette. But it sounds like it was pretty good, and it's good that they included something like that, right, to help teach people how to use the machine once they bought it.
Exactly. Again, the approach to education was always pretty flawless. they knew you were curious about it, and it comes from them because they were curious too. They built the machine because they were fascinated by computers, and they wanted everyone to have computers. I mean, that's what really made the Spectrum was it was aimed for anyone to have one, rather than it being sort of more a product that was aimed at the higher end of the market. It was almost utilitarian in that respect.
Now, as far as ports go, you mentioned already the fact that the original Spectrum, at least, didn't have very many ports. I mean, it was it had a power port, it had audio ports, mic and ear, and a TV port, and then it had that expansion port, which, as you said, was their way of giving the ability to attach other things that you might need for future growth, I guess, of the machine. Mm-hmm. So there wasn't a lot else. Now, once the ZX Spectrum Plus came out, they did at least add a reset button, which was not something that wasn't on the original machine.
Well, yeah, this is going back to me tripping over that cable in my first Spectrum. It was the most requested feature because if you loaded the game up, there wasn't any way to get out of the game and back to the original screen without removing the power. Right. The result of that is the most common fault on the Spectrum. I'm going to correct myself now because I said it was the keyboard, but actually the most common fault on the Spectrum was the power connector becoming frayed. Because you were forever pulling it in and out to reset the computer. And either the connector, the actual barrel, the wires and the barrel would wear out, or the jack itself would lose its springiness. Everyone was delighted when the Spectrum Plus came out, and there was actually a reset button.
Yeah, that's one of the things I've talked about before on the show, the fact that I have several UK machines, and almost all of them don't even have an on-off switch, right? Because as I understand it, in the UK, there's actually a switch right at the plug.
That's right.
Yeah, so they didn't put them on the computer, and that was something I had to get used to. In the US, everything had a on-off switch actually on the computer.
Yeah, I mean, it's cost. If you don't put a switch on it, don't put a switch on it. The problem with that, though, is you assume you can get access to that plug socket, which you can't always do. Certainly in my setup at the moment, I can't get to any of them. So a very common add-on, which I've got on my Spectrum now, is a little adapter that goes into the barrel connector for the 9 volts in. It's about 3 inches long, has a switch in line, and then you plug in the power supply to the back of that.
Yeah.
Problem solved.
Yeah, I've thought about getting something like that as well. Now, when the Spectrum Plus came out, as I mentioned, they added that reset button. They also changed the keyboard, so they had an injection molded keyboard. It's a little bit bigger. It's about 3 inches wider than the original Spectrum was. And other than that, it's the rest of the depth and the height are pretty close to the same, but just 3 inches longer. It had a user guide companion cassette, and also had the power supply, the RF cable, and the cassette cable as well. Not a huge number of differences, I guess, when the Plus came out.
No, and exactly the same PCB inside.
Now, when they came out with the 128, that is the one that you mentioned that has the large external heatsink on the right end of the case, giving it the nickname the toast rack.
That's right.
Which would get pretty hot, I guess.
As I say, you had to get careful after it being on for an hour or so that you didn't brush your hand past it, because that's going to hurt. I don't think it's something that today's health and safety would allow.
Yeah.
But yeah, we didn't mind because it was such a powerful machine. We were quite happy to put up with that.
I don't have a 128. I have a 128 plus 2, but the 128, looks like a really nice machine, and wouldn't mind having one.
Yeah, the big change was the sound chip.
Yeah,
that's what, as well as the extra memory, obviously. But they put the AY sound chip in there, which brought it up to the level of the Commodores of this world. So finally we had some good sounding things, and they had a really strong software release to go alongside it that really took advantage of the extra memory and the music. So I remember things like the Never Ending Story, I think, was one of the release titles, which was a graphic adventure, but now came with glorious music. So we were all very excited about that.
Now, did that actually come with the machine, or you mean that there were software that took advantage of it?
That was software that took advantage of it, but I think they did bundles where it came with a few games like that, and I think that was one of the more famous ones.
They did add quite a few ports when the 128 came out. They put an external keypad port on the front, an RS-232 MIDI serial port, and you have your mic and ear ports on the left-hand side, and then on the back was an RGB monitor port, which something added, the expansion port, and the TV port.
Yeah, certainly the RGB port was a big thing, because around that time the SCART standard was starting to get popular in Europe. I think that wasn't a big thing in the States. I think because you went more the component route with sort of higher quality images. So SCART was a European standard, quite a bit ugly, big chunky connector. But one of the things it supported was a pure red, green, blue signal. And you could get a cable that plugged into the monitor port and it would plug into your TV, and you had a TV that could accept that RGB signal. Suddenly your big fuzzy screen that you've got used to over the years of your Spectrum is now razor sharp and clear. So that was a big deal.
I can't tell you how many RGB to SCART cables I have for a lot of my different machines, because I have a SCART to HDMI converter, to get HDMI then out the other side. So I have a lot of cables that go to SCART, and that's something that we just didn't have in the US.
Yeah, I've got one of those converters too, so that's what I use when I'm testing my machines. Well worth getting. So what else? Yeah, the RS-232 MIDI. This is historically, this was Clive Sinclair's frustration that he wanted his machine to be taken seriously as a business machine. He wanted it to be used for commercial purposes, and I think the MIDI is part of that as well. But it never really happened. And the external keypad. Now, that is absolutely to do with the fact he wanted people to do spreadsheets. So the idea was that the external keypad will give you that sort of the classic calculator layout keyboard, and it was on a little curly wire that would come out from that. But it was only ever released in Spain. It was the actual keypad for it never came out anywhere else. And so, as you can imagine, examples of that keypad are very rare indeed and very, very expensive.
Okay. Now, we'll move on to the Spectrum Plus 2, which was Amstrad's first Spectrum. Mm-hmm. And it came in a totally new all-gray case with a spring-loaded keyboard, dual joystick ports, an actual built-in cassette recorder on the right side, with cassette control buttons below the recorder. And as far as ports go, so it was quite a bit wider. It's a very wide it's a very wide computer. It takes up an entire shelf. Whereas the original Spectrum, you could put, 3 of those on one shelf. The Plus 2 takes a whole shelf by itself because it's so wide. Yeah. But on the ports, on the back, you had audio and TV out ports, the RGB, keypad, RS-232 MIDI, expansion, and 9-volt DC. And then on the left side were the joystick ports and the reset button. So it was substantially different than any of the previous machines in terms of where things were and just the way it looked.
Yeah, it's a real clash of philosophy between Clive Sinclair's idea of like cheap. If you don't need it, don't put it in there. And let's get the price down to the absolute minimum, then people can buy whatever it is they want. What Alan Sugar, who is the head of Amstrad, who bought the company off Clive Sinclair, his attitude was make it as easy to use as possible. So as I said earlier, you've got your Spectrum, you've got a load of wires, you've now got to find a plug socket, you've got to find a cassette deck and a plug socket for that, you've got to find a TV and a plug socket for that, and then you've got to wire it all together. And then you're probably going to get in someone's way doing that. Whereas the Plus 2 is basically everything except the TV. And at the same time, Amstrad were releasing their own personal computer, the 464, and that generally came with a monitor. So the idea was you don't need anything else. Yes, it's a bit more expensive, but you have everything you need in one box to do this. So the Plus 2 was following that philosophy of make it as simple to use as possible.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, to be honest with you, the big win on it was you spent so much time faffing around with the tape deck, trying to get things loading, doing things like azimuth correction and things like that, and tape cleaners and volume adjustments. He had something that was hardwired into the machine, so it just worked, which is, again, something that Commodore 64 people with the data sets have been enjoying for years. So that side of things was really nice.
Then if you have a 2A or a 3, those look very much like the 2. Mm-hmm. Except a black case instead of a gray. The funny thing is, I had a 2A for a while, but the case actually says Plus 2 on it. So unless you know the black one is the 2A and the gray one is the 2, you don't know by looking at the machine or looking at the way it's designated that it's a 2A.
That's right. Yeah, and they're very different inside. So what happened was. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So they're completely different PCBs, because what the 2A is the Plus 3, which I'm sure we're going to move on to, but with a tape deck, not a disk drive.
Right.
So it's a new PCB that can handle the floppy drive. But yeah, so functionality-wise, 2A is no different from the 2. It was manufactured in a different place, but my memory's fading as to where. But it's a completely different PCB inside.
It is my understanding, though, that starting with the Plus 2A, it was like less compatible with software than the Plus 2. I know I had some trouble when I had my 2A. I had some trouble running some software on it that I didn't have trouble with the Plus 2. Yeah,
so the Plus 2 PCB is very, very, very similar to any of the ZX Spectrum PCBs. They literally just put a tape deck to it and put it in one single case. The 2A and 3 are a complete redesign of the PSU. Of the PCB. And as a result of that, it's inevitable that compatibility problems come in. And that's happened throughout the Spectrum's history. They went from issue 1 to issue, I think, 6A or 6B. I can't remember quite which. And all along there's been little glitches along the way that certain pieces of software won't work. And part of the reason for that is that programmers were quite happy to break the rules of what they couldn't do with the Z80 processor and the ULA, because if they did that, they could get more things out of it. There's a very long history of that in the ZX Spectrum. But as someone, I can't remember whoever said it, but someone said right at the end of the Spectrum's history, if people hadn't have done that, we'd all still be sitting there playing horoscope skiing. Which is one of the very first games that ever came out. And if you look at how complex ZX Spectrum games got by the end of its main lifetime, it was quite incredible how they found things to do with that machine. The downside of it was that subtle changes to the machine, to the ROM, and to the PCB layout would actually catch them out, and you'd end up with incompatible software.
Right. So what was it like to actually boot up these machines, right? So that's something I always like to cover. I mean, it's a little bit, like I said, every machine is different. But the 16K, the 48K, and the Spectrum Plus would boot up and be very similar and look very similar to booting up a ZX80 or 81. Right? It would come to a machine, all it would say is Sinclair Research at the bottom. And it's like, okay, what do I do next? If you don't understand what you're supposed to do next, it's like you don't know what you're supposed to do next, right? It doesn't really prompt you. So, the original Spectrum had the same sort of basic entry that the 80 and 81 did, where you just type a single letter, and so you were entering keywords, based on single key entry, that sort of thing, in order to save ROM space, and that was pretty much the way. You had to know what you were doing when you booted the machine up, and understood how to use the shortcuts that were built into the machine.
Yeah, that system, that token system, is absolute genius on Sinclair's part because of the memory savings it afforded them. But oh wow, how frustrating for a coder to have to use the system. So the idea was you couldn't just type on it like you could on a Commodore or a Dragon 32 or an Oric or any of all these other computers, or a TRS-80s you mentioned earlier. You had to look for the key. Like, for instance, the letter P was the word print. So you want to print something on the screen, you could press P and it would appear with the word print. Then you could do a double quote, and then you're allowed to type something, and double quote, press enter, and it will print it on the screen.
And it was smart enough to know, when you were typing something, what sort of thing to expect next, right?
Yes.
So,
and it would tell you off if you got it wrong.
Right.
So it would I mean, as you said, when you first boot it up, and one of the things I've always loved about all 8-bit computers from that era is you just switch them on. I remember getting my first PC and being absolutely confused by what was happening with, power on self-tests and all the rest of it. And
right.
I was like, why can't I use it yet?
It takes me 5 minutes to get to anywhere that I can actually do anything. Yeah.
Whereas, switch a Spectrum on, you're ready to go. And if you want to make, people of a certain age go dewy-eyed, just say to them, copyright 1982 Sinclair Research Limited. And, they'll get that sparkle in their eyes as they remember seeing that for the first time. And what do you do now? Press a key and you get a flashing K, and the K means keyword. So it says, right, I want a keyword now. So that means that you need to find the letter with the keyword you want. So all the programming commands are all just written on the keys. And I think the Spectrum holds some kind of record for having the most functionality within a single keyboard. So you remember reading that somewhere? Because the keys can have it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 possible functions per key, depending on what mode it's in.
Yeah. Definitely, it's ingenious, and I can see how you could get used to that. If you use it a lot, I could see how you could get used to it. But for me, like knowing that when you type an L, that is going to give you the let command, right? When in my mind, I'm probably thinking, well, it's going to be load or something like that. It would just take a while, I think, to get used to.
Yeah. The muscle memory did come in after a while. And you do sort of like instinctively know where thing is. The real one was finding the combination of going into extended mode, shift, and then pressing the key to get the red one written underneath or whatever you were after like that. That could sometimes be more than a little frustrating. But the reason he did it that way is to save memory, because he didn't need to hold the whole word in memory like print.
Right.
He could just hold the token because it's just P. And that was genius. That made memory management in the Spectrum so much more powerful.
Yeah, and of course, again, that was a feature that was brought over from the ZX 8081, which used the exact same technique. But the nice thing is that once they came out with the Spectrum 128, now they introduced the 128 Basic, and you could actually you could actually type the entire program, right? You could either use the 48K Basic. It would come up with a menu, ask you whether you wanted a tape loader, 128 Basic, a calculator, 48K Basic, or tape tester. And if you chose the 48K Basic, you had the same single key entry of keywords, just like we just talked about. Or you could choose the 128K Basic, and then you could actually type your entire program without the single key entry of keywords.
Yeah, the irony was I got so used to it by then. When I tried 128K Basic for the first time, it's like I've got to type all the printouts.
You got to type. Yeah, you got to type the entire thing now, not just a few letters.
I can't do that anymore. Yeah, so irony.
Yeah,
it got a lot more sensible because obviously it had a lot more memory to play with.
Yeah,
back then 128K was just huge. It was just so much more memory.
Right. And of course, because it was 128K Basic, there were some additional commands. There were ramdisk commands, an improved basic editor. There also was a tape loader that was built in to directly load a tape without typing any basic instructions.
Yeah, well, that made sense because I'd say a good 80% of people who found the Spectrums, the first thing to do is press J for load, and then a couple of double quotes and press enter. So why not just have that as a one click?
Right. Yeah, exactly. There was a calculator mode that...
I never really understood that.
I never really did. I mean, that seems a little crazy to me. Calculator is just another application. Why build that into the menu? I'm not exactly sure why.
I just got a feeling whoever was working on the ROM got bored one afternoon and thought,
And then there was a tape tester that was built in that would allow you to check your cassette player to make sure that your volume was set correctly to minimize issues in loading software.
Yeah, that could be very useful.
Then once you got to the Spectrum Plus 2, I mean, all the following machines used the same menu or had a similar menu that would come up. When you got to the Plus 2, it didn't have as many options. You had a tape loader, the 128K Basic, the 48 Basic, and the calculator. They left the calculator in there for some reason. But,
yeah, they did. It's always a bit of a touchstone moment as well because the copyright Sinclair Research disappears at that point and it now says Amstrad Consumer Electronics PLC.
Yes, correct. And they got rid of the tape menu options because the tape recorder was built in. You didn't have to worry as much about setting the volume correctly or anything like that.
That's correct, yep. Yeah, so a little easier those days.
And then once you got to the Plus 2A and the 3, there actually was a tape loader. Tape loader was still there. This is the tape tester. The tape tester is what they removed from the Plus 2. They still had the tape loader, but now in the 2A and the Plus 3, they had the loader. So they changed it from tape loader to loader. And now it says Plus 3 Basic on the Spectrum Plus 3. That's
right. And you notice that you see 2 drives available on the 3 because it's the Plus 3 had the 3-inch drive in it, but it could still load from cassette externally. So you still had that option. So
no, that's a good point. So the initial screen that would come up on the Plus 2A would say drive M available at the bottom underneath the copyright, but on the Plus 3 it would say drives A and M are available. And drive A was the built-in drive, I assume.
I think it's the other way around actually. I think M is the built-in drive. Yeah, and A was the 3.5-inch drive. Don't quote me on that one. I think so.
Yeah, I'm sorry. That's what I meant. Drive A would be the built-in 3.5-inch drive, and M would be the cassette, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. Cool. So that's pulling a machine out of the box and turning it on and using it.
Yeah. So as we've gone through all the different versions of Spectrum, if I can just interject at this point,
sure.
An honourable mention because it's very. It pleases me greatly to say the Spectrum is far from dead. We mentioned the Harlequin earlier, but now we have the ZX Spectrum Next. So this was a remarkable project put together as a Kickstarter to create a brand new ZX Spectrum. And what would you do if you built a machine today that took the philosophy of the original ZX Spectrum and moved it forward, also while making it completely backwards compatible? The result was very, very successful. It took a long time to get it going, but we now have a new ZX Spectrum called the ZX Spectrum Next. And wonderfully, it was designed by Rick Dickinson, sadly no longer with us, but he designed the original ZX Spectrum, ZX Spectrum Plus. So he's very famous for his industrial design philosophy. And it's an absolutely gorgeous machine. It's fully compatible with all ZX Spectrum stuff, including peripherals. It's got the same peripheral connector, the bus out the back, but also a whole load of other things. So you can network with it. It's got a built-in multiface, which is probably something we should have mentioned earlier. The wonderful multiface peripherals, which allowed you to pause the computer and take snapshots of the memory, which was great for save games where you couldn't normally save a game. You could literally snapshot the memory and then load it back in and carry on where you left off. That's brilliant. And it's got an SD card, so you can load games in from the SD card. It's quite a wonderful piece of kit. And the first edition, which I'm lucky enough to have one of, there is a second edition currently in progress, where you do have a chance to get one of these machines for yourself and have a brand new ZX Spectrum.
So do you have a ZX Spectrum Next?
I do. Yeah, I was straight in there on the first Kickstarter to get one of them, and it's sort of my daily driver now. If I want to fire up stuff, because it's as modern as you would expect. It's got HDMI out. Mm-hmm. And it can become any model you want. It even has the ability to load different cores. So if you want to turn it into a BBC Micro, you can.
Oh, really?
I don't know why you would do that, but you can. And as I say, it's got built-in joystick ports. It's also got higher resolution modes with no color clash. It's got a meg of memory now instead of just 128K. It's got 102.4K. It's quite an impressive machine.
And you can't get those today, right?
You have to go on Kickstarter. There's a second batch being made. I don't know if they've sold out now.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
I bet they're not inexpensive.
To be honest with you, I think for what they achieved, I thought it was a very fair price.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
The second-hand market's ridiculous.
Yeah, I'm sure.
But the actual asking price, I think it was very, very fair. Considering they had a lot of fun, and by fun I mean, sorry, the British irony for you, that it was an absolute hellscape trying to get the thing made.
Yeah, I heard some of that story from some of the previous guests I've had on here to talk about the Spectrum, but it sounds like it was quite a story.
Yeah, I mean, it was quite amazing that they were trying to recreate this machine in the 2010s, and they were tearing their hair out saying, how did they do this in 1982? What was their secret?
Right.
Especially the keyboard membrane, which became a real sticking point for them, trying to get the keyboard membrane working. It's certainly, if you it's a sort of a real nice step up from emulation, because it's have this lovely physical device. And it's because it's all done using FPGA.
Mm-hmm.
That's what's driving it under the hood.
Amazing what you can do with FPGA these days. A lot of really cool stuff.
Absolutely, and as I say, you can get it on the internet if you want to, which is even more astounding to me.
Or you can just run an emulator on your modern machine.
You certainly can.
And we'll talk about that in a little bit here too. So let's jump into magazines and newsletters. Try to run through that topic here fairly quickly. There were quite a few magazines that were available back in the day, and there's even a couple that are still running today that you can get Spectrum coverage. I found a couple of sites that had good information about the magazines that were available. Wikipedia has a page just on ZX Spectrum magazines, that was good information. And then at oldcomputers.com, I found a lot of information as well. But one that was pretty popular, and I heard you mention this already, and then one that was a favorite of yours is Crash Magazine. And that came out in 84, ran to 1991, and by Newfield Publications, and then until 92 by Europress. And it was relaunched in December 2020 with the backing of the original founders. So you can actually get Crash Magazine today.
That's right, yes. In fact, I was quite astounded to find it in my local newsagents a few weeks ago, which really made me smile, because that was I used to have it reserved for me at the newsagents, and I knew what day it would be coming in, and I'd go in after school, get the latest Crash. So a lot of the original Spectrum magazines, we'll go through some more of them, were quite serious, sensible. I think sensible is a better word. They were very sensible magazines. Crash turned up and said, we're having none of that. And Crash were the sort of the punk rock magazine of the scene. They were fun. They didn't mind being a bit rude sometimes, a bit silly. They didn't take themselves too seriously, and I absolutely adored them. And as I mentioned earlier, I ended up writing to them saying, "Can I write some articles for you?" And I did for a couple of years, which was a fantastic honour.
Yeah, I'm going to have to look up those articles now that you said that.
Yeah, it's under Paul Evans, not PJ Evans, but yeah, they're there.
Okay.
Yeah, so to be able to do that when I was so young was great, and what that underlined was the genius that the founders had, Roger and Oliver, because they realised that to make a successful magazine, you needed to employ the people who were using the computer, whereas a lot of the others were getting in, career journalists. They went and hired a load of kids.
Right.
So when I got to visit Newsfield's offices in Ludlow on one occasion, and yeah, everyone was my age at the time, and I was like, oh wow, this is great, this is fantastic, and that enthusiasm and sort of minor anarchy sort of really came through the pages, and you ended up with a fantastic magazine. And yeah. And also, one of its most remarkable things was Oliver Frey's artwork, which is, in our community is now the stuff of legend.
Nice. Okay. Well, that's something the listeners can certainly check out today if they want to subscribe to Crash Magazine. And I think I've got one or two copies of that magazine, either the magazine itself, or I think they put out an annual as well. I think I've got one or two.
Yeah, they've done a couple of annuals. Yeah, I'm actually looking at them right now. Yeah, they've done a couple of annuals, and they've done some, as you say, some A5 format recreation of the magazine. So, I mean, again, the emergence of the ZX Spectrum Next has really sort of helped bolster that. But it's been really nice to see it come back.
Some other magazines that were available as well. There was one that originally came out with the name Your Spectrum in January 84. Later was renamed to Your Sinclair beginning in January of 1986. Their intention was to expand into coverage of the QL, but the QL obviously never really took off much, and other computers that Sinclair might produce, and that was before Sinclair got out of the computer business, and but they covered mainly the ZX Spectrum, and seemed to be a very popular magazine. It stopped publishing in September of 1993 after the magazine had shrunk to fewer than 40 pages an issue. And a 94th issue, a retrospective, was published in 2004 and given away free with Retro Gamer magazine. Do you have this one? Do you have this issue?
I think I do. Yes.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. That rings a bell. Yes. Retro Gamer is a great magazine.
And then in '99, a webzine called YS3 or Your Sinclair 3 was launched by some Sinclair Newsgroup regulars who managed to recreate something of the original magazine style and humor and ran until 2002. There is now a blog out there called www.ys3.org that you can that's still kept up to date today. So it still lives on in some form.
Well, that's great to see.
Did you have a subscription to your Sinclair?
I bought it a lot, yeah.
Oh, yeah?
I mean, it and Sinclair User, they were quite similar in style. And, if Crash was punk rock, then these two were more your middle of the road, adult-orientated music sort of kind. They were a bit more serious. They would cover more, they would review things that weren't necessarily gaming, whereas Crash was razor focused on gaming. And they would do more in sort of like the hobbyist side of things, like coding and like making your own peripherals and things like that.
Yeah, you mentioned Sinclair User. That was that one was published between 82 and 93. Was the longest running Sinclair based magazine. Had news, game reviews, previews, tips, help guides, columns, readers' letters, and cover-mounted game demos.
Yeah, that was a very popular thing on all of these ones. Crash certainly did a lot of work with that. So you would expect, by the end of it, you'd expect to get a tape, sellotaped onto the front of your magazine that would have demos or freebies. It became a big arms race between those three key magazines, certainly in the later years of the Spectrum. And it was a great way of building up a nice collection as well. It was a very cheap way of getting some great games.
Yeah, and that one ran until 93, so that ran pretty long. Well after Sinclair quit producing, or Amstrad quit producing Sinclair machines.
Again, my memory might be failing me, but I think 1993 is the last ever commercial release before the homebrew resurgence for the ZX Spectrum, which I think was Dalek Attack. And I think that was in 93, but I'd have to check that.
A couple other magazines I found. These were These were not produced in the UK. They were produced elsewhere. One was called Spectrophone.
Oh.
It was an electronic magazine produced in Russia. Appeared on a monthly basis. There were only 23 issues from 93 to 97. So that was That was pretty late.
Yeah.
Are you
this is news to me. No, this is news to me.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I've heard of this one. It came actually on a floppy drive. It included both text and programs. Had several columns in every issue. Yeah, so that one I thought it was interesting just because it was produced internationally rather than in the UK. And then there was Sinclair Programs. That one was produced in the UK. Dedicated entirely to listings for programs for the ZX 8081 and Spectrum. All stuff contributed by readers.
Amazing.
And then another one was ZX Magazine, which was a Czech magazine. It was produced for the Spectrum and some of the other compatible computers, like some of these I haven't even heard of. The Delta, the Didactic, and Sam Coupe.
The Sam Coupe, yeah, that was meant to be the big successor to the ZX Spectrum. It was a heck of a machine. Came with a floppy disk drive, very, very powerful, and fully compatible with the ZX Spectrum.
And that magazine actually ran until 2005. So that was very late.
2005. Well, the ZX Spectrum was very popular in Russia, except no one in Russia had a ZX Spectrum. They had one of the many counterfeit versions.
Yeah, right.
That were made.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay, well, that's it as far as what I could find on magazines. Anything else you want to add there? Any others that you're aware of that we didn't cover, or
just a fond memory, and the names escapes me unfortunately, but there were a couple of attempts to make magazines that were tape only. So literally, you go to the magazine rack, and it would be a piece of cardboard with a tape stuck to it, and that's what you'll buy. and all the articles were on text that you would load in, which initially felt like quite fun, but very quickly got tedious. So I didn't think it lasted very long.
Okay, that's it for this episode of Floppy Days. I want to give out special thanks to PJ Evans for taking the time to co-host with me today. I thought he did a wonderful job of providing color for the various topics on the ZX Spectrum. I provided links in the show notes for all the great websites we discussed during this podcast. Just go to floppydays.com for the full list. I very much encourage you to provide feedback for the show. There are many, many ways to do that. You can do it at Apple Podcasts or on the website, via email at floppydays@gmail.com. You can go onto Twitter using @floppydays, on the Twitter-like Mastodon at floppydays@oldbytes.space, on Facebook at facebook.com/groups/floppydays, or on the Discord server, whose link can be found at floppydays.com. Besides the website and Apple Podcasts, Floppy Days is available for streaming at TuneIn, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, Stitcher.com, and Spotify. Until the next show, pull out a vintage computer and compute as if it were yesterday. Bye.